Hello friends, today's discussion will be on ultra-virus transactions, that is doctrine of ultra-virus. My apologies for writing the entire thing in a smaller font size. Please appreciate the fact that entire points have to be in a particular one video session, and therefore this efforts of writing it in small font size, I believe that you will pardon me for that. In continuation of it, let's see what you mean by doctrine of ultra-virus, or what are the transactions, effect of the transactions which is ultra-virus. First and foremost, we need to understand the meaning of the term ultra-virus. It means beyond the powers. Whatever the existing powers are there, if any activity is done beyond such powers, then we call it as ultra-virus, which is beyond the powers. Are we clear on that? Yes. It is applicable for only those acts which is done in excess of the legal powers. So if you are performing an act which is within the powers, then doctrine of ultra-virus cannot apply over there. However, if you are performing a transaction which is beyond the powers, which is beyond either the legal powers given or the powers authorized to a particular person or to a particular company, if the activity or the transaction is done beyond such powers, only then this gets attracted. Therefore, it presupposes that the powers are basically limited in nature. You can't get unlimited powers. Either the powers are limited by a document, or which is like a MOA, or it is limited by a document which is limited by a law, provisions of law, for example, Companies Act 2013. Therefore, any power which is given presupposes that it is limited in nature. The extension or beyond the nature transactions will always come under the shelter of doctrine of ultra-virus. So we'll see the impacts of what happens in the case of doctrine of ultra-virus. Let's see. Basically, the powers to the company comes from Memorandum of Association, which is again subject to the provisions of Companies Act. So, if you are doing an act which is within a Memorandum of Association, the transactions can be called as intra-virus, that is within the powers. However, this MOA, if you have added any points or if any new powers are being given in MOA which is against the Companies Act, that is why I have precisely mentioned it as subject to the provisions of Companies Act. We know the fact that in MOA we cannot have any clause or any point under any of the name clause or objects clause or liability clause. Any of those clauses cannot consider points which is against or contrary to Companies Act. So it might be a technical case where you may have powers within the MOA, but such powers are contrary to Companies Act, and hence everything has to be in sequence. That is, the powers given in MOA should be in line with what the provisions of Companies Act is. So that brings us to a point of discussion. What if it is not so? Then please check this. Therefore, if any act is done by the directors of the company which is beyond their powers, then it is wholly void and inoperative and is not binding on the company. So in case there is a transaction or an activity which is beyond the powers given to the directors or which is beyond the powers given to the company, then such transactions will be treated as null and void or wholly void and inoperative. Basically, it will not be binding on the company. Yes, we have a little bit of discussion to make. What if it is beyond the powers of the directors but within the powers given in MOA for the company? That I will deal with when I come to this section. As of now, what you have to understand is, if any transaction is done which is beyond the powers of the company, then such transactions are not binding on the company. Therefore, it will be treated as wholly void and inoperative. Moving further, therefore, the company can be restrained from employing funds for other purposes other than what it was sanctioned, and further can also be restrained from carrying on a trade which is different from the one authorized to carry on. I've just given a couple of examples as to how it works. So basically, if the company wants to employ funds for a different purpose other than for what it was sanctioned at the general meeting, then the company can be restrained by using doctrine of ultra vires, stating that it is beyond the powers to use the funds for purposes other than what it was sanctioned. Let's say it was sanctioned for project A, and let's say the company wants to use these funds or employ these funds to project X. Since the funds were sanctioned for project A, it has to be used only for project A. It cannot move the funds for project X. If an effort is taken by the company to move the funds from project A to project X, it is beyond the powers of the company, and hence it will be treated as an ultra vires transaction. Basically, it can be inoperative in due course if and when there is a legal litigation. Having said that, there is another example that I have given. Let's say the company wants to change the business or change the trade which it was carrying on. Initially, when the company started, it had provided it in the objects clause what was the business it wants to do and the various connected businesses. By chance, if the trade is shifted or the new business which the company wants to start off is just blindly started off without it having the power in the MOA under object clause, then such new business can be restrained, that is stopped from being executed as it is beyond the powers given under MOA. Are we clear with the two examples? Fine. Remember, in case of an ultra vires transaction, the company and the third person cannot sue each other. That is the basic point. Since we come to a point where it is not binding on the company, then what is the next course of action? What happens in the courts? Basically, what happens is the company also cannot sue the third person. The third person also cannot sue the company. That is why I said it is inoperative. The impact of it, keeping in mind the third person, is please remember the clauses or the points which we had discussed while dealing with the doctrine of constructive notice and MOA being a public document. The presumption of law as far as MOA is, the third person who wants to deal with the company has notice or has information about whether the company can enter into such a transaction or not, or whether the transaction is within the powers of the company. The law presumes that the third person knew it because MOA was a public document. That is what doctrine of constructive notice said. In other words, having known the fact that this particular transaction is beyond the powers of the company and still the third person enters into such a transaction which basically is an ultra vires transaction, then how can you protect the third person by giving an option for him to file a suit against the company? In simple words, even the third person cannot file a suit on the company in such ultra vires transactions. So it is pertinent to note the fact that the third person who wants to enter into a contract, it is better for him to always refer to the memorandum of association of the company, which is a public document, and refer the powers given under the objects clause, whether at all the company can enter into such transaction. If the company is not permitted to enter into such a transaction, then better avoid it rather than facing the legal issue. Are we clear on those 2 points? Fine. I would like to further give an example where lending money under a contract, if it is beyond the powers, what will happen? Let's say A Limited has received money from Mr. X. A Limited, assuming has no powers to raise money from the market and or from any person whatsoever other than banking channels. If the clause is given in such a way that A Limited can proceed to raise funds from a banking channel, but it cannot proceed to raise funds from any other person, then in such a scenario, if A Limited has received funds from Mr. X under a contract, here the transaction is clearly ultra vires. Neither Mr. X can sue the company, nor the company can sue Mr. X. The transaction is basically inoperative. Sir, is it fair enough to blindly state that it is inoperative? Yes, it is fair enough, because X, who had to lend money to the company, is bound to have understood the fact, is presumed to have understood that MOA is being read by him, and in that MOA as he verified whether the company has the powers to raise money from Mr. X in the form of a loan, and in spite of it, if X has lent it, that is his ignorance of law. Having known the fact that ignorance of law is not an excuse, then how can we protect Mr. X under this clause? It is not possible. Having said that, there are principles of natural justice. Equity has to prevail. What if this money lent by Mr. X to A Limited was not at all used by A Limited? Can Mr. X file a case for reclaiming his money? Yes, to that extent, yes. So, point to be noted here is, if A Limited has already utilized the money, then neither X can file a case on A Limited, nor A Limited can file a case on Mr. X. What happens in this suit? Where money is not yet spent by A Limited, whose money does it belong to? Basically, it belongs to Mr. X. So he can sue or file for a suit for injunction. That means he can ask the court to stop A Limited from using the funds and giving back the funds to Mr. X, as Mr. X is the owner of the funds. Are we clear on this, my dear friends? Repeat the video again, rewind it and check the example, the explanation part of it. You will understand it even more better. Once, twice, no problem. You can do it. You will be able to get the grip of the example what I just explained. So that was the basic points as far as Doctrine of Ultra Vires was concerned. Now we shall see a popular landmark judgment in the case of Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company Limited versus Ritchie, the year 1875 this case law relates to. What were the facts of this case law? First, in the objects clause of the company, there was to make, sell, lend on hire railway carriages and wagons. Please appreciate, it was about railway carriages and wagons. So the company could have made, sold or lent on hire railway carriages or the wagons related to railways. Now, it also had another point of additional business, or rather another objects clause which relates to carry on business of mechanical engineers and general contractors. Mechanical engineers and general contractors related to railways was the intention. It appears to be that. Further, to purchase, lease, sell and work mines. That means the company could have gone and purchased a work mine, or could have leased a work mine, and could have sold a work mine. Mines in its typical sense, what you generally know. Maybe it is a iron ore mine or a manganese ore mine or a gold mine for that matter. The company had the power to do it. Fourth clause or fourth objects clause was to purchase and sell as merchants or agents coal, timber, metals, etc. So these were the basic